was born in Lodz, Poland, on July 2nd, 1935. Lived there with my mother and father and my sister. Sort of typical middle-class life. Remember the most pleasant time that I remember is Sunday afternoons with my father, going for ice cream and balloons and enjoying things that children enjoy. And that was the way. We lived in a very nice apartment, a large building. My father had his own business that he, in the lumber business, which his family was in. And my mother was a housewife. She even had help for my sister and I. So, typical people, as we would think of a middle-class American.
And you took vacations, and there's one lovely photograph of you and Lila, your sister, as children before the war at the beach.
We did. There we have a couple pictures that were saved, and that was in the countryside. And my parents always teased me that I was a daredevil because there was a big German Shepherd there in the country, and I had no fear. I would go into the dog house with the German Shepherd, and it was good times. You know, I was not afraid. And maybe it made me a better person for that in the long run, that I was not afraid.
And then comes the 1st of September, 1939, when the Germans, unannounced, attack Poland, and Lodz, located in western Poland, is quickly overrun. The German army arrives on the 7th of September. Your father flees to Russia, believing they won't harm the women and the children.
Well, my first memories of that, the beginning of the war, is when everybody in the house that was there was very upset and crying and looking out the window. And out of curiosity, I did too. And what there was happening, that there was a very large Orthodox temple across the street, and everybody was upset because the Germans were taking out all the prayer shawls and prayer books and putting them in a heap in front of the synagogue, and finally torched it. And this is how I remember the beginning of the war.
Your mother dictated a memoir, and in it she says that the Germans handed out cookies and candy to the non-Jewish population who stood and watched as the synagogue burned.
Well, that was for their propaganda, to show people that everything was all right. It was a happy time for them. It was a very, very hard time for the Jewish population.
And do you remember that first day when you were ordered to wear an armband with the Star of David?
Well, my mother was sitting there having to sew this star on. And we were actually wearing it on the front and on the back. So if you went outside, you were forced to wear it. So whoever saw you in the street would know who you were, that you were Jewish. And so my sister in the stroller had to have a Star of David on, this yellow star that in the middle said Judah, Jew. And so no matter if you were 2.5 or if you were 80 years old, you had to wear it if you were outside.
And this was the first time that you recognized that you were Jewish?
I never thought of myself as anything other than just a child. Jewish didn't mean that much. We were assimilated Jews. My parents were assimilated. They didn't wear the outer garment that you would obviously know that they were Jewish. We looked like everyone else. You'll see in the pictures that looked like any other normal Polish children, except that we were Jewish.
Now you were different.
Very different. That's when the difference began. That's when I felt we were different. And being Jewish was something that caused grief and just was part of the struggle that began.
And you were expelled from your apartment by the Nazis?
Well, when my father left, the three of us were left together, my sister, my mother, and I. And she received orders that she would have to vacate the premises because it was such a large building that the Germans would be taking over. And she had a couple of hours that she had to clear out, but before she cleared out, she had to make sure that the linens on the beds were changed and the table was set for company. And she was only able to take 2 little suitcases with her to carry for my sister and I and herself. It was a terrible, terrible time for her, having to leave everything that she owned and not really knowing what would happen. I can't imagine the feelings that she had to go through.
You had an uncle in Warsaw, Henry Tempelhoff. He was a mechanical engineer. His wife was a doctor. And so your mother made the decision, without your father present, to go to Warsaw, that it was perhaps safer in Warsaw. And when you left Lodz, your mother said, "We left this place with a big scar in our heart."
My father tried to get us back to Russia, but we just never made it because my sister became ill. And so my mother became frightened, and she decided to go to Warsaw. And when we went to Warsaw, the ghetto was there, and all the Jews were in this one. They just kept bringing more and more Jewish people into the Warsaw ghetto. She went there because my sister was ill, and I imagine that by having a sister-in-law who was a physician, that she thought we would be better off there. Of course, it turned out to be the worst place that we could have gone to. How do you describe the Warsaw Ghetto? Food became such a precious possession that we didn't have it. And there were times she had to go stand in line to get the ration of bread that she would receive. And one time, she told us she came back that she had received her bread and was just leaving when somebody that was really starving ran up to her and stole her bread. And that was all she had to feed Lala and I. I can't imagine at this stage in my life as a mother and a grandmother when children tell you they're hungry and they want to eat and you have nothing to give them. It's very hard for me to understand how she did it.
There were almost 500,000 Jewish people in the Warsaw Ghetto, and a quarter of them died of starvation.
Well, I know exactly how they felt because as we lived in Warsaw Ghetto and as it was progressively getting worse and worse, the atrocities in the streets were horrendous. I mean, you could look out the window and you would see dead bodies in the street. You would see a wagon picking up all these corpses and trying to clean up. The worst thing that I remember is that seeing people that just dropped in the street, they were dead, but because maybe they had a sock or a shoe or a pair of pants or some kind of clothing on, somebody that would be passing by and would see these articles of just a dead body, he doesn't need it any longer, and they would cover up the body with a newspaper and take whatever possession this poor soul had.
Clothing.
Anything. And to this day, I mean, the worst thing I can see is somebody putting a newspaper over themselves because it just brings back that memory. And this is what we saw, and people and children were starving.
And you were on the verge of death, and all of a sudden, your father returned.
It was I wouldn't be sitting here telling you this story if he hadn't shown up.
He smuggled himself into the Warsaw Ghetto, having come from Russia when the war between Germany and Russia broke out. It was a Saturday morning, your mother wrote, in December 1941.
And she went to the door and I passed out because of the shock that he came back, that it was 2 years that we were separated. So by this time, my sister and I were, like the rest of the population, emaciated from hunger. And we're to the point of just sitting around in the bed and not really moving a lot because of weakness. And I remember my father saying that when he saw us, he was afraid to touch us. And he was afraid to touch us because we looked so frail. And he brought us back to life because he brought with him bread, butter, and he cut up the bread into little cubicles. And he fed us a little bit at a time, knowing full well that if he gave us too much food and our stomachs were no longer used to it, that we would become ill. So that's the reason why when I say what happened to us, I say that I wouldn't be sitting here telling this story if he hadn't come back, that I would have, my mother and my sister and I would have perished as everyone else did.
And your father was a wizard with his hands. He had golden hands. He could create anything. And so he gets a job in a German factory in the Warsaw Ghetto, becomes a manager, but then the raids begin, and he and your mother are at the factory, and to protect you, he fashioned a false bottom in a chest, and you and Lila, your sister, would stay in that.
Well, it was, like my mother called it, the vegetable bin. A chest that would hold things on top. You lifted the top, and you would store things in it. And so my father put old rags and old newspapers and on the top. So if you lifted it, didn't look very nice. You wouldn't want to go through it. But underneath, he had built two little benches, or two little seats, and a potty. And when they went to work, they left with us whatever they had, some water and whatever bread they had. And they would put us into this piece of furniture and put it against the wall and go to work. If you ask me today, how did we do this? It's very hard for me to explain because having grandchildren, it's not that easy to keep children quiet. But it was a different time and place. Children in Europe were supposed to be seen and not heard. And as my mother later on in life tried to explain, she told everyone that she had two very obedient daughters. And I think we knew, we grew up very fast and realized this was a matter of life and death, that we had to be quiet, that we couldn't talk when just any time we wanted to. Once we were in there, we had to be quiet. There were times that because when everybody went to work, when all the older people or able people had to go to work, and the Germans would come through the building, and you could hear them walking up the stairs. And they came into the room. You could hear them talking, and yet we weren't found. I always think back, had they brought with them the German dogs, shepherds, of course we would have been found. But somebody was looking over us, and they didn't. And my parents would come back, and of course, at night, we'd be out with them in the room. But there were many things that you just cannot explain, that for some reason, I think the Almighty was looking over us.
Did you think that God was on your side during the war?
As a child during the war, I never thought of God. I think in my later years now, I look at it as my mother talked to God all the time, and she really believed in talking to God, and she believed that that's what brought her through, what helped her survive and deal with all these things that she had to deal with. Now at my age, when I look at it like it is a miracle. Things did happen for a reason, and the only way you could explain it is God was watching over us.
And then the final liquidation of the ghetto commences. And in January 1943, your father, through his connections, namely a Polish non-Jewish military officer, arranges for y'all to be taken out of the ghetto, hidden in a garbage truck, and suddenly you're on the Aryan side of the wall, outside the ghetto, and you have arranged to find lodging with a Polish Christian family.
Well, this is what we call the righteous Gentiles. That this mother and daughter, the daughter must have been in her 20s. They took us in, and they didn't have a very large place, but there was enough room for us to move in. They made an excuse to their neighbors that family was coming from the countryside, and that would explain why we were there. The problem there was that we were to live as Christians, as Catholics, and live like the two women. I'm olive complected and I have dark curly hair. My sister was fair, she still is, and had lighter hair. She looked very Polish, and I looked Jewish. So there was a problem that if people would notice me, that I might give everyone away. That Poles would be killed just as we would be, just for having us there.
That was the Nazi penalty.
That was
Giving shelter to a Jewish person invited death for you and your family.
That was the ultimate crime that you could commit. So my mother would take my sister out. My father found a job and he went to work. And my mother would take my sister out and make believe, they did go to church and all go shopping. With me, I stayed inside. And if company came, then I would have to hide in this single door armoire and sit in there until the company left. They tried to even dye my hair. They took some old bark off a tree and boiled it in this real hot, boiled water and tried to dye my hair. Well, it didn't work. So my mother, I think, feeling sorry for me since I wasn't getting fresh air and I wasn't getting out. At night, when it was dark, she would put a bush on my head and let me sit on the balcony. There was a little balcony there. And I did this for a few nights. And one day, evidently, the woman across the street noticed that I was only sitting out there at night. And she went to the janitor that was taking care of the building and told him that she noticed that we must be hiding some Jews there because of what was happening, and that unless they reported us, she would. And of course, when my father came from work and heard the news, then panic set in because we would all be, find demise, the Poles as well as us. But because of his golden hands and because he was such a good worker, he went to his boss, who owned a lumber yard, and explained to him that we no longer could stay in this apartment because other family members were coming, and would he allow him to put us in a lumber yard, build a shack that was in the back, and he would also be able to be a watchman. And so this is what he did. The boss did let us move in. He patched up real fast this little hut that I remember, black tar paper and no lights, that sort of thing. And this is where we went to move. We moved in.
And the owner of that lumber yard suspected that you were Jewish, but looked the other way.
He definitely did. What happened was that as we had false papers, my parents never changed their name. The last name was Skorecki, which is a very Polish name. And but yet the name was known in the lumber business because my father's family was known for lumber. And somebody evidently must have questioned him. Why are you having this man Skorecki here, But he did. He looked the other way. Not till after the war, I think, that my father really knew that the man knew who he was.
So many miracles.
Unexplainable. It makes you think, why us? Why not somebody else? You just can't explain some of these things.
And your parents saved you, but in a sense, you and Lila saved them because you gave them a reason to continue struggling.
I think that's true. I never thought of it like that, but they had a reason through all the horrible things times that they had to go through, all the decisions that they were just one step ahead of us getting caught. So it's true. They had an incentive. They had a reason to go through all this and not to give up.
And so finally the war comes to an end. The Soviet army arrives. The Germans flee to the west. And your mother goes to register after the war.
Well, she went back to Lodge to see, first of all, to register. But when you registered, people would come in and see who survived, and you'd put your name on a list, and people every day would come by and check that list. When she went to register, and she said, well, I had a husband and 2 children, they looked at her like she was mad because the Germans had killed 1.5 million children. There were no children. My sister and I were an oddity. She actually had to bring us to the office and prove that we were her children. Can you imagine what it must have felt like? They've survived. They finally could be free and admit that they had children, and people didn't believe them.
So after the war, you lived a number of years in a German village, ironically. And then in 1949, you come to New Orleans. And in Poland, you had been persecuted because of your religion, but in New Orleans, you could ride in the front of the bus because of the white skin.
I was worked at this time already, and I was riding buses back and forth to work. And that little plaque that said colored only, people would get on a bus much older than I, and I've been brought up where you're supposed to give your elders your seat. You're the young one. Somebody older comes in, you're supposed to be polite, and I couldn't do it. And that it was impossible, hard to be able to move. I could sit anywhere I wanted, and it was very hard to move that sign just so I could sit in that seat. Because as long as that seat was there, no matter how many empty seats were behind me, the blacks could not sit there.
And I wonder, coming from a world that was destroyed, what message you have for people here in this world.
It really hurts, and my only contribution, and I hope that this is the only thing that I can contribute to, knowing what it feels like to be persecuted for being Jewish. The same thing it goes for Black. That to teach the younger people, to teach in schools what tolerance is all about. You have to embrace and be willing to listen to the other side. I mean, we're all the same, and it's a matter of teaching the younger people that you have to be tolerant just because you believe in a different God, just because your skin is black or white. If we could ever, ever come to the point that we would judge a person by who they are, rather the way they look or what God they believe in.